So this is my long-awaited A-level history exam questions little series that we're going to do. We're going to have a look at the AQA A-level exams for history, and we're going to look at the 3 questions individually and how to answer them. So this question we're going to look at the essay questions. The next video we're going to have a look at the extract questions, which are the ones from paper 1, and then we're going to look at source questions from paper 2. Because they are slightly different. But the first one we're going to look at essay questions, okay? And in every video we're going to look firstly at the structure of the exam and of the entire A-level as a whole. So the assessment structure looks a little bit like this. So your AQA A-level history is split into 3 sections. So you'll have 2 exam papers and you'll have 1 piece of coursework essay, okay? And for this video we're really going to focus on the exam papers. Okay, so there are 2 exam papers you're required to sit. It is required that one of these be focused on British history and the other be a different area of history. So you have to do at least some bit of British history, unfortunately. Paper 1 is what's known as a breadth paper, which is looking at a branch of history that's more than 100 years. And then paper 2 is what's known as the depth paper, which is focusing on a smaller time frame in history. And the specification outlines that the paper 2 depth paper is looking at a specific period of history where significant change happens. Okay, so paper 1, what is assessed? Well, the specification suggests that the study of significant historical developments over a period of around 100 years and associated interpretations. Now that's important. Associated interpretations, what it means by that is the extract questions. Okay, so the interpretations from the extract questions that we'll look at in a different video. The exam is 2.5 hours long for A level, and you must answer 3 questions. Section A will be a compulsory extract question. You only have 1 choice. You have to do that 1 extract question that is given there. Section 2, you pick from 2 of 3 essays. Okay? And the exam is worth 40% of your final grade. Paper 2 is very similar. What is assessed? The study in depth of a period of major historical change or development and associated primary evidence. So the phrase here, associated primary evidence, refers to the source question. So whereas paper 1 was looking at extracts from historical interpretations, so from historians explaining a period of time, the source questions are primary sources. They were sources that were written at the time or around the time, and you have to look at how to develop and how to analyse it. It has the same structure as paper 1. You'll have a compulsory source question, not a compulsory extract question, but you still also have to answer 2 essay questions. And now let's move on to the essay questions itself. So essay questions look a little bit like these. So these are just taken from 3 of the different options that you could have done. So they tend to have one of these 3 structures. So you might have a to what extent. So to what extent were governments responsible for the growth of the British economy in the years 1815 to 1850. You will also have possibly just a statement, and then you're asked to assess the validity of this view. Or if you're doing AS, you're just explaining whether you agree or disagree. So the only difference is the phraseology at the end. So, for example, the Battle of Gettysburg was decisive for the outcome of the American Civil War. Assess the validity of this view. And then finally, you might have a sort of how far or how far do you agree question. So one like, how far was Stalin's creation of the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe after the Second World War the result of his obsession with ensuring international security for the USSR? So that's quite a mouthful, but these are the types of questions you're going to get asked. And we're going to have a look at how you answer them now. So essay questions are really a chance for you to put forward a debate about an important historical event or a series of events, okay? So the essay should be balanced. However, you can conclude one way or the other. So what I mean by this is, if we to go back and pick one of these, so the Battle of Gettysburg was decisive for the outcome of the American Civil War. If we argue yes, if you agree with that, you can conclude that yes, it was decisive. However, you can't just do 3 paragraphs explaining why it was decisive. You have to put a counter argument, and then you have to sort of weigh up the arguments and explain why your conclusion is the way it is. So that's what I mean by it needs to be balanced. It needs to have both sides of the debate properly analysed, but you can conclude whether one way or another. You don't have to just sit on the fence the entire time. There's no one single structure that you should follow. However, the first thing you do need is an introduction. We're going to look at a structure that I personally would champion, because it's really an essay structure that you could use at A-level, at university, and just whenever, really. If you're doing a PhD, use this essay structure, because it's the most basic and it gets the entire job done for what you need to do. So first we'll start with how to do an introduction. So in the introduction, you should aim to outline the argument you're going to put forward. So, for example, say what you're going to talk about. So if we go back to the Battle of Gettysburg was the most decisive outcome for the American Civil War, well, let's say you agree with that point. You can put that in the introduction. You can say that this statement is valid. This is a valid statement. And you're going to explain why it's a valid statement throughout the rest of your essay. So if we just go for the next one. So the introduction is supposed to tell the reader what you believe and say how you're going to prove it. So the rest of the essay should prove the conclusions that you've drawn from the introduction. So you should do maybe a short little sentence introducing the wider range. So introducing just the Battle of Gettysburg, for example. You should argue that you should suggest that there are arguments on one side, arguments on the other side. However, it's most convincing to argue that the Battle of Gettysburg was the most decisive. Or if you want to argue the other way, it wasn't the most decisive. And then this is going to be proven through the essay. Okay, this is going to get proven through the individual paragraphs. Talk about the individual paragraphs you're going to make. Okay. So this is sort of the conclusion you put in your conclusion at the start of the essay, and then your actual conclusion at the end of the essay is just wrapping up everything that you've done. It's just concluding everything you've done. Okay. So what about the main body of the essay? Now this is where most people get stuck up and don't do very well. So again, there's no one way of structuring it, but you should aim for around 3 paragraphs. 4 if you've got the knowledge and you've got time to write it in the exam, but 3 tends to be the sort of golden number for when it comes to answering essay questions. 2's a little bit too, not enough depth really. However, if you manage to write 2 spectacular paragraphs, then you might do very well. Who knows? Like I said, there's no one way of structuring it. So here's what I believe is the best way to structure the main body of an essay. Okay, so your first thing you're going to do is pick 3 different points you want to talk about. So, for example, if you got an exam question, if you're doing Tudor history and you got an exam question on Henry VII's foreign policy, like was it successful or not, your aim should be pick 3 different points. So for that, you could talk about his foreign policy with France, his foreign policy with Spain, and his foreign policy with Scotland. Pick 3 different points you want to talk about. Okay, and then we follow what is known as a Geon structure. Now, before we go on to the Geon structure, these 3 different points can be 3 different, like I said, 3 different points within a period of history. So 3 different, like for the foreign policy question, relations with 3 different people. Or it could even be 3 different periods of time. So if you'll get a question that specifies the time period, so if we go back to the example question, I'm going to go all the way back. if we go all the way back to the example question, this first one here being, to what extent were governments responsible for growth of the British economy in the years 1815 to 1850? You're given a time frame. You're given 1850 to 1850. And if you know your knowledge well enough, if you know your historical background well enough, you could split that period of time into 3 smaller groups. So you could talk about the growth of the British economy between 1815 to 1825. And that could be an entire paragraph, and you just analyse that bit. And then the second bit, 1825 to 1830. And then 1830 to 1850. Whatever you want to do. So when it comes to 3 points, you don't have to pick out 3 specific little things. You could pick out 3 time periods, which is also a good idea. Can be seen as a very good way of answering the question. But when we do answer the question, it's best to follow, in my opinion, the GEON structure. Okay, so what does GEON stand for? So your first point is your judgment. So almost repeat the intro, but in the context of what you're talking about. So if we say Henry VII's foreign policy was successful, you'd probably not ever get a question as lovely as that if you were doing the Tudors, but let's just say Henry VII's foreign policy was successful. Your judgment, your first being, Henry VII's foreign policy was successful because of his relations with France, for example. That's your judgment. That's sort of your point, the point you're going to make in the paragraph. Okay? Your explanation should be using historical evidence to explain why you think that. So it was successful with France because of the Treaty of Etaples. The Treaty of Etaples did many things. It gave Henry VII a pension. It allowed for you know what? So you have to use the evidence that you've got, that you have in your brain, and you have to explain why that evidence supports your judgment. Okay? Why does that evidence support what you're saying? And then O stands for the on the other hand. On the other hand, what are the reasons why this evidence or this judgment that you have, what are the reasons for it not being the case? So what have you got any counter evidence? So use evidence that suggests the other side of the argument, okay? And then the final bit, the bit that's the most important bit, is you've agreed on one hand and then you've disagreed within the same paragraph, which is very good. And then nevertheless. What you're supposed to do is, nevertheless, explain why the previous argument isn't as valuable as your argument. So your argument is this bit up here. So you've made your judgment, you've made your argument, you've used your historical evidence to explain why this argument is valid. You've then gone onto the other side of the argument and explained why it might not be valid, or used other evidence to put another argument forward. But then what you want to do is you want to argue, you want to explain why this argument here, this counter-argument, isn't as good as your argument. Maybe the evidence isn't as valuable, or maybe it's taken out of context, or maybe that, yes, it suggests that this evidence that is used here suggests this thing. However, if we also think about this evidence over here, then it suggests, something different. Okay? So this is a really good structure, and if you repeat this 3 times for 3 different things, and you obviously have good historical context, you should be absolutely fine in answering essay questions. So your conclusion should effectively just follow the same structure as this GEON. Okay? You're not supposed to add any other evidence into your conclusion. You shouldn't. Once you get to the conclusion, you should rest easy knowing that you don't have to remember anything else about the topic that you're being asked about, okay? The conclusion is literally just to wrap everything up, okay? So you put your judgment, you explain why you think that, you go, on the other hand, this, in paragraph 1, it was said this, and in this, and in that. Nevertheless, this argument is invalid because mine is better, effectively. Okay? That's me dumbing it down as much as I possibly can. It's very hard to explain how to answer an essay question. It's sort of something that it has to sort of come intuitive to you. So that is the conclusion. The conclusion shouldn't be too long. It shouldn't be too drawn out. And then again, it also shouldn't be too short and basic. So it has to sort of, again, it has to be just right. And this structure would help you develop that and make sure that conclusion is perfect. So what are my top tips for answering these exam questions? Well, I think the best way to get good at them is to just practice. Literally, there are loads of past papers online. There are loads of past paper questions or practice questions, exam questions in the textbooks that you have. You just ask your teacher to just make some up for you, or just make some up yourself. Literally just practice them. It was always good to use your notes to plan the essay. So you take as much time as you need to plan an essay and to make notes on how to plan the essay. And then maybe write the essay in time conditions. And just get your teacher to mark it or just to quickly skim over it and do as many of these as you can. The more of them you can do, the better you're going to get at answering exam questions. Okay, so that's really the most simple and easy way of getting the highest grades for the essay questions.